September 27th, 1988. It's a warm autumn afternoon in East Colorado Springs. School's out, and 15-year-old Chuck Limbrick has met up with his best friend, Christopher Morrow.
The two of them had gone to the same school, and then Chris's family moved north. Chris was such a dedicated friend to Chuck that when he wanted to visit Chuck, Chris actually had to take the bus.
The boys arrive at Chuck's house on Potter Drive just past 4 p.m. But Chuck is surprised to find the front door isn't open as usual.
It's locked.
He realized that he had lost his key. There was a neighbor who kind of kept keys for the neighborhood kids in case they got locked out. They went to the neighbor's house to get the key that was always kept there.
Hey, Mr. Roberts. My front door is locked. I was wondering if you had a key.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think it's that one.
Alrighty. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we'll be back.
Hey, Chris, how's your dad?
While Chuck tries the key, Christopher stays behind to chat with the neighbor, Bill Roberts.
Dad enjoying his new job?
Yeah.
But the friendly conversation is interrupted by a blood-curdling scream. Bill and Christopher race over to the Limbrick home. Once inside, Bill makes a gruesome discovery.
He went through the front door, downstairs, and found Betty Limbrick. She'd been shot in the head once.
Oh, my God. Okay, well, boys, back upstairs.
While Bill ushers the boys back to his house to call 911, young Chuck tries to process the traumatic event.
He was badly shaken by that, horrified by the realization, and then actually sick to his stomach over the whole thing.
When first responder Don Chagnon arrives on the scene, he proceeds with extreme caution.
We checked the interior of the house to make sure that there was nobody else inside. See her downstairs, face down on the floor. There's a large pool of blood underneath her head. There was no vital signs. She was obviously beyond resuscitation.
Once the victim is pronounced dead, homicide detective Lt.Joe Kenda is notified of the body.
Kenda.
We are always called anytime a death occurs outside the presence of a doctor to determine method and manner.
Minutes later, Kenda pulls up at 520 Potter Drive and takes a moment to survey his surroundings.
Everything about this neighborhood is perfectly normal. All these homes are very well kept. There are no houses in any state of disrepair. This is a major event for this neighborhood.
Before stepping inside,
Where is it? What do you got?
Kenda asks Officer Chagnon for his take on the crime scene.
When I first came down, saw a lady laying in a puddle of blood.
When we first got there, I only saw the one shell casing, the entry wound to the head, which would be typical of a suicide.
But Kenda knows that violent crime investigations are not always that open and shut.
There are a number of possibilities as how this person came to be dead. You can't pursue one versus another more vigorously because all could be true. You don't know enough yet to have an opinion.
To determine if this death is in fact a suicide, Kenda needs to learn more about the victim herself.
Who is this woman? Her name is Betty Jean Limbrick. She's 42 years old.
She was extremely well liked in the community, just a wonderful lady. She was kind of the all-American mom, holding down jobs, did charity work, worked very hard for her church.
It would seem as if Betty Limbrick had a lot to live for.
She is married. She has several children, most of whom are adults and have moved out of the house. She has one child remaining at home, and that's Chuck, the young man who found her when he borrowed the neighbor's key.
Kenda and his team have also learned that Betty's work schedule often allowed her to return home in the early afternoon.
She worked for School District 11, and she drove a bus full of kids every day. So she worked in the morning, and then she was off for a couple hours while the kids were in school, and then she went back and drove the kids in the afternoon after school.
Something about that scenario doesn't sit right with Kenda.
Something's wrong here. You have a 42-year-old woman, mother of several children, who's discovered in the middle of the afternoon in a upper-class neighborhood in her own home. She had only been home a few minutes when her death occurred. That's unusual.
Kenda makes his way down to the basement, where he finds Betty Limbrick's body at the foot of the stairs.
Gravity affects the amount of blood that's seen at a crime scene. There's a slight cant to the floor. Her body drains blood. So the blood pool is thick and it is huge, because most of the blood in her body, 6 to 8 pints, is now on the floor.
Kenda notices more evidence sprayed across a nearby wall.
The only thing that'll produce high-velocity blood spatter is a bullet. It is traveling faster than the speed of sound, and it breaks the human body upon entry. It produces a cloud of blood, a red mist, referred to as high-velocity blood spatter. I see that on the paneling next to her body. I need to look closer. It requires me to step in the blood. Part of the nature of this work is you get dirty. I get into a crouch and I look at her head. She has a single entry, close contact gunshot wound to the left temple. When I say close contact, I mean that the gun was less than an inch from the surface of her head.
All signs indicate this may indeed be a suicide. Until Kenda discovers that Betty's head wasn't the only point of entry.
She has a gunshot wound in the right hand. It's from the back of her hand at the joint to the middle finger, and there's an exit wound in her palm. Because the hand wound would be very painful, she may be collapsing from the pain. Then the second shot is administered. This doesn't fit at all with a suicide.
The 2 slugs Kenda finds on the floor confirm his suspicions about the true nature of the crime.
One has ricocheted, most likely the hand wound. The other's the headshot. We determined them to be .357 Magnum. And I'm thinking, well, pretty hard to shoot yourself twice. Plus, apparently a little fairy came and took the gun away. I don't think so. Now, unless this lady works for this circus, she didn't shoot herself. Somebody else did. Now, I've gone from low to 6th gear. This is a murder. In the middle of the afternoon in a nice neighborhood. This changes everything, and it gets a lot more complicated.
Kenda begins this homicide investigation the same as all the others, with a simple but crucial question.
Who would want to kill her? Somebody wanted to. I have no idea who. I need to find out. But at this point in time, possibilities are endless.
Making matters worse, the killer has almost a 2-hour head start.
I don't like head starts. The person responsible is busy. They are destroying evidence. They're distancing themselves from the crime scene. They're establishing an alibi. They're doing all kinds of important things. And what are you doing? You're walking in a circle, wondering what the hell happened here.
And this is where we found the purse.
That's when Officer Chagnon leads Kenda upstairs, where he's discovered a promising clue.
Her purse. All the zippered pockets are open and unzipped. Her credit cards are there. Her ID is there, but there's no cash.
The missing cash leads Kenda to a new line of thinking.
Did she come home and discover a burglary? And in panic, the burglar shot her? That's a possibility.
The purse isn't the only piece of evidence pointing to burglary.
There was some signs of forced entry to the back of the house.
You got the window that's open in the back, you got the screen pulled off, you got some footprints in the dirt under the deck.
Maybe somebody thought she was going to be out of the house all day instead of coming home for that split between her shifts. Maybe something bizarre happened.
While considering the home invasion theory, Kenda uncovers another crucial clue.
Where's her car? She parks in the garage. There's nothing in the garage. Now I need to find a car. I want to know who or what is in it, and I want to know right now.
But before Kenda can track down the missing vehicle, he'll discover there's even more to Betty's murder than meets the eye.
You look at that body. That's up close and personal. That's not shooting her from 30 feet away, or just firing a couple of shots and getting lucky. This is an execution.
"42-year-old Betty Limbrick was found by her son lying lifeless in a pool of blood. The initial theory was suicide, but Lt.Joe Kenda has discovered evidence that points to a breaking and entering gone awry. And Kenda has just identified a pivotal clue missing from Betty's garage.
Where's her car? She drives it to work every day. She parks in the garage. There's nothing in the garage. You have a screen off a window, you got footprints in and out of this room, you have cash missing from the purse, now you have a stolen car. What if one or two people break into this house because they think nobody's home, our victim comes home, there's a confrontation, shots are fired, they steal the car, and they run? Very possible.
Finding the missing car could lead Kenda to Betty Limbrick's killer, or killers.
We put that out to every agency in the area. Car stolen in a burglary homicide. Here's the vehicle, here's the plate number. Find that car.
In the meantime, Kenda needs to speak with the first witness on the scene, Betty's youngest son, Chuck.
He discovered his mother dead. That is tragic.
According to neighbors, Chuck was especially close with his mother.
What you got?
She dotes on him. She loves him. She gives him her undivided attention. They describe Chuck as a quiet, polite young man who is a budding musician.
He was a diamond in the rough, and he was a very, very strong influence in the program because he believed so highly in music.
By all accounts, Chuck is as popular as he is artistic.
He was running for one of the officers of student council the very next day. So very well liked by the student body, obviously very charismatic.
Detectives find Chuck Limbrick next door, where he's being consoled by neighbor Bill Roberts and his best friend Christopher Morrow. Kenda knows it's an unusually delicate situation.
Hey Chuck, I know this is really, really horrible. I'm very sorry about your mom.
I realize this kid has just lost his mother. And I tell him that. Chuck, I know this is a horrible thing. It's a horrible thing. But I need to ask you to tell me what happened.
I was walking home. We were walking home. And,
Chuck gives it a shot, but the conversation is short-lived.
He starts to tear up while he's telling me this. I don't want to press it much further than that. This kid has already seen his mother dead in his house. I don't need to make his day any worse than it already is.
Chris, is there anything you can add to it?
Kenda turns to Chuck's best friend, Christopher, who is also visibly shaken.
I ask him to tell me what happened. He repeats the story. It's identical to the story he tells the officers. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm sorry to have to ask you these things. It's part of the work.
Kenda has learned nothing new from the boys' accounts, but he wonders if neighbor Bill Roberts could shed some light on the case.
I go talk to Bill. Do you know if Betty has any enemies? Has anybody would hurt her?
She was just a real nice person.
Everybody loves Betty. Nobody would want to hurt her.
It's a refrain Kenda has come to know all too well.
I often talk to relatives and neighbors, and they say, she didn't have an enemy in the world. Well, I disagree. She had one. That's what made her look like this. People lead secret lives. People know each other based on surface contact. They don't know what's beneath that surface. They don't know what's really going on in someone's life. We have to find that out.
Is there anything else you'd think of?
You know, I heard rumors that there might have been an infidelity, but I don't know.
The neighbor was able to flesh out the situation of the Limbrick household a little bit more. There was a little bit of neighborhood scuttlebutt that maybe there was an affair going on. Maybe Betty was having an affair. So yeah, you got a woman dead in her home, no particular reason, middle of the day, purported marital problems, friction going on. I'm looking for that husband.
People always say, well, it's the husband. Well, a lot of times it is. People who live together closely have issues. Is Dad a suspect? You bet he is.
The alleged affair isn't the only thing pointing to Mr. Limbrick as a possible suspect.
He did tell me that he recently bought her a gun for protection.
Well, you know, Chuck Sr. told me one time he was going to buy a gun to give to his wife for her to protect herself. Not only do we have a married guy, now we have a guy that maybe bought a gun. Well, at this moment, I'm real interested in anybody that owns a gun.
Could marital troubles have led Chuck Sr. to murder his own wife and attempt to disguise it as a botched robbery? To find out, Kenda must track down Betty's husband.
I need this guy, and I'd like to have him 10 minutes ago. Is he running from this crime? Does he have the gun he bought with him and he used it to kill his wife? Well, we're going to find out, because I need Charles Sr. in my hands.
Mother of four, Betty Limbrick, was found shot and killed in her basement. Lt.Joe Kenda has learned that the victim may have been having marriage troubles. And her husband, Charles Limbrick Sr., recently purchased a handgun. Could trouble in paradise have led to a domestic homicide?
It is common. Unfortunately, married men and women don't always get along. Somebody decides that it's time for this to end, and we're not going to bother getting involved in the expense of an attorney. We're just going to buy this gun, and I'm going to resolve this right now.
The first order of business is to track down Betty's husband.
Where is Charles Sr.? Does he have his gun in his waistband and he's crossing a state line to get away from me?
Kenda's team zeroes in on Charles Sr. It turns out he is crossing state lines, but not for the reason Kenda suspected.
All the effort finally produces his whereabouts, and he's 800 miles away.
Her husband was a truck driver and he was out of state.
The guy had a rock-solid alibi. His trucking company knew where he was. He had been in touch with them.
It's the moment of frustration you get in these cases. She'd been dead for less than an hour when discovered, so unless he's got an F-15 in his pocket, he's 800 miles away. Could not have been him. I liked Dad. Dad's not part of it. Now what?
Just then, the case takes a dramatic turn.
Kenda.
Patrol unit calls says we have the car. Boom.
All right, I'll be right there.
I'm thinking, okay, we may find evidence that's critical. We could find fingerprints. We could find all kinds of goodies in that car.
Less than 2 miles from the crime scene, Kenda finds the missing vehicle.
There's the car, parked in a shopping center parking lot.
How you doing?
I think I found your car.
Didn't touch anything, did you?
No, sir. I got crime while I've been around.
All right, thanks.
We look it over. There's no blood transfer on the steering column. No blood in the car at all. There's no evidence apparent of any value in the vehicle.
No blood, no weapon, nothing in the backseat? No.
The lack of evidence only raises more questions.
This is not what auto thieves do. They don't drive a short distance and walk away. It's very odd to me. Why is the car there? Why is it so close? Why is there nothing in it? It's, at that point, a mystery to me.
Kenda and his men canvassed the nearby shopping center in search of anyone who might have seen the person behind the wheel of Betty's car. It's certainly no easy task.
Joe Kenda.
Jay Bernard.
You see this four-door car right here?
Yes, sir.
Do you happen to see who dropped that car out?
No.
You're asking people to remember who parked a car in a 3,000 car parking lot. Good luck.
How long has it been there?
A couple hours. No, it's been there for 2 days. No, it has.
Nobody has a clue. Somebody thinks it's been there for 5 days. Somebody else thinks it's been there all morning. So you have all sorts of misinformation coming into your hands. Nothing of any use.
Kenda and his crew are back to square one.
The frustration just keeps building. So you have to just stop. Just stop. I want to think about this. Where are we now? The only thing that's still true right now is Betty's still dead. Nothing else is. So we've got nowhere. Let's go back to the beginning.
The beginning means the crime scene, and any potential witnesses who may have slipped through the cracks.
Was there anybody that wasn't home that we can go back to now and talk to? Oh yeah, several addresses, no answer. Fine, do that and come and tell me.
Later that afternoon, one of Kenda's men radios back with a promising new lead.
He says, you're gonna like this. I'm gonna like what? I got a kid, juvenile female, this girl named Nikki, who says she's got information about this case.
Directly across the street from the Limbrick home, Kenda meets 14-year-old Nikki Lindquist.
How you doing? I'm Joe Kenda, the detective working on this case.
I came home to see a bunch of people in our driveway, not knowing what was going on. I remember being, pretty shocked.
You have some information for me?
When Kenda asks the teenager if she saw anything unusual the day of Betty's murder, she immediately drops a bombshell.
I was walking home from school, and I saw Chuck Smallman's car driving down the road.
I know the family, I know Mrs. Limbrick, I know her car. I saw that car today.
This kid from school, Chris, he was in the car.
I couldn't see who was driving it, but the kid in the passenger seat was Christopher Morrow.
The same Christopher Morrow Kenda had spoken with just hours earlier, who was there to console his grief-stricken best friend. Could he have something to do with Betty Limbrick's murder? Kenda asks Nikki to tell him more.
Well, I know Chris has been in trouble with the police.
Chris was in my 8th grade history class. He was kind of troubled. There were times he'd lie, and it was probably one of the things that kind of helped me make the decision to distance myself from him.
So I have somebody run Christopher Morrow's name.
When Kenda's men do a background check on Christopher, they realize he's more than just your average troublemaker.
He is an auto thief. Got arrested for stealing a car. He talked to the police and gave them a bunch of other names and arrested some other people too. 2 things key in my mind when she says that. Okay, he's a thief, but more importantly, he's a talker. He doesn't like going down by himself. That is terrific information to have.
It also leads Kenda to believe Christopher's grieving friend routine may have been an act.
Everybody lies to me. I'm accustomed to it, but it doesn't stop me from taking it personally. So it's time for a little payback with Christopher. My whole demeanor changes. I'm no longer confused. I'm no longer walking in a circle. Christopher Morrow, you little bastard. Why was I feeling sorry for you? The race is already over. He just doesn't know it.
"15-year-old Chuck Limbrick came home from school to find his mother, Betty Limbrick, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. After several false leads, Lt.Joe Kenda has finally narrowed in on a suspect, Chuck Limbrick's best friend, Christopher Morrow.
Here we are, we're in close pursuit of a 15-year-old boy with a stolen gun for killing his friend's mother. All the frustration, all the oversight, mistake, things that are happening. Nobody seems to know Dad is 800 miles away. We're getting nowhere in the burglary thing. Nothing's vague now. The smoke has lifted, the air has cleared, and I'm focused. We need to talk to Christopher. And we need to rattle his bones.
But there's still a nagging question about Kenda's new suspect.
The concept of a 15-year-old friend killing somebody's mother, you go, what are the dynamics with that? You know, especially he was in this woman's house frequently, had been for a couple of years. What could she have done that would have made him want to murder her?
You've got to have a reason to kill somebody. It may be an insane reason. It may be completely twisted. It could be anything. But you need a reason. Does Christopher Morrow have one? I don't know. Let's go find out.
Before interviewing the teenager for the second time, Kenda needs to speak with the boy's parents.
You never go directly to someone. You approach them from afar. Their family, their friends. You circle them a little bit and see what you can learn. So Christopher has a father and a mom. Let's go talk to them.
Samara, is your husband home?
Yes, Detective Kenda.
Show him for me, please.
When Kenda arrives, he gets right down to business.
Do you have a handgun, Mr. Merrill?
Yeah, I do. Go get it for me, would you? Comes back downstairs with a look of shock in his face. He says, I can't find it. You can't find it? No.
Do you have any idea where it is?
I have no idea. You have paperwork on that gun? I do. Let me see it. Smith & Wesson Model 19, 6-inch barrel, .357 Magnum revolver.
The slugs found at the crime scene were from a .357 Magnum.
Now I'm thinking, okay, Christopher's in the car. Christopher has a gun that he stole from his own father, and the gun's the right caliber. Now we are cooking. I don't have any more theories. I have Christopher, and he's going to be all I need for right now.
I want to speak with your son again right now.
Fearing the worst, the Morrows begin to panic.
They come unglued. Well, is Christopher involved in this? Oh my God, are you going to arrest my son for murder? One question after another, which you ignore. I ignore. Your son may or may not be part of that investigation. We need to talk to him right now.
When Christopher sees Lieutenant Kenda again, the 15-year-old doesn't look happy.
He walks into the room, stops dead in his tracks. Hello, Christopher. How are you? You remember me.
I've seen.
I have more questions. And I want you to think about it before you answer me. I want you to clearly recall what you did. You understand? Yes? Tell me.
We walked home to Chuck's house, and the door was locked.
He goes through the same story, pretty much on the mark.
As Christopher spells out his version of events again, Kenda gets an idea.
I know that Christopher can talk. He has before. I'm thinking of ways to get into his head. While we're sitting there just talking and he's telling me a story, I'm looking at his shoes and I'm thinking about those footprints I saw.
Those are pretty nice shoes you got there.
Let me see it. And he kind of extends his leg and lets it profile. And I said, no, take it off. Well, I don't want to take it off. You take it off or I'll take it off. So he takes off the shoe and he gives it to me. I turn it over and I'm studying the tread. I'm not studying the tread, but I want him to think I am. And I'm not saying anything to him. I'm just looking at it very, very carefully.
Did you find it strange if I told you we found a footprint outside of the window that matches the tread on these shoes?
No. A whole lot of people have those shoes.
It's true, a lot of people do, Chris. But you know something interesting? So do you. And now he's rattled. He's shaking, he's scared to death. Great. I've got both fingers up Christopher's nostrils. And he knows it, and so do I.
You could even see that troubled look in his face. And he was feeling that Christopher wants to tell me something right now. He wants to get this off his chest. He knows he's getting in too deep. How can I help him do that?
So I asked him a punishment question. Very useful technique with adults. It works especially well with kids.
What do you think should happen to somebody that kills someone in cold blood?
And his lip is quivering the whole time.
They should be locked up for a very long time.
What if that person was a kid?
What do you think ought to happen to him? Silence. Oh, Christopher, I could kiss you on the mouth.
Kenda has his prime suspect right where he wants him.
When you see those tells, the eye movement, the facial muscle contortion, the nervous feet, all the things that liars do, you are rounding that clubhouse turn. You're talking to the right guy. You just have to get him to go the rest of the way.
I want to tell you what you're going to do, Christopher. You're going to start telling me the truth.
Tell me what happened. And Christopher, don't lie to me. I know it when you lie to me, and I don't like it.
Little does Kenda know, Christopher Morrow is about to reveal the most shocking truth of all. And take the investigation in a direction no one saw coming.
He impresses me as a participant kind of guy. He's not a leader, he's a follower. Followers don't shoot people, leaders do.
Lt.Joe Kenda is interrogating 15-year-old Christopher Morrow in order to uncover his role in the murder of his best friend's mother, Betty Limbrick. The teenager appears ready to crack.
He's getting himself in deeper and he knows it and he's trying to look for a way out. And that's when he came clean and said, let me tell you what happened.
He lays it out. Absolutely lays it out. Chapter and verse.
What Christopher reveals is not what Kenda expected. In fact, it's anything but.
Christopher says that about a month ago, Chuck comes to him.
Chuck told me he was gonna run away.
He just wants to go start a new life, and he wants to go to Canada. Christopher says, you know, I'm gonna run away with you. I got in trouble over that car thing, and my parents have been on my case, and I want to go to Canada with you and live there.
But the morning they planned to leave, Chuck called Christopher with a last-minute request.
He says to Christopher, bring some protection. What do you mean? Bring a gun. Do you have a gun? My dad has a gun. Bring it. So he goes to his father's closet, takes the gun in the brown holster, throws it in a backpack, and heads over to Chuck's.
The boys pile into Chuck Sr.'s car and pull out, headed for adventure up north. But they don't get very far. While at an intersection, Chuck sees something that alters his plans.
Chuck sees his mom driving the Buick on her way home from work.
We gotta be her home.
And he speeds up, floors the car to get there before she does. He doesn't say why. He doesn't say why he needs to beat her home. He just says that he does.
And they drive back to the house before Mom gets there. They go in through the back window and they wait downstairs.
When they get inside, Chuck says, did you bring the gun? And Christopher, yeah, I brought it.
Give me the gun. Why? Just give me the gun.
So he does, he gives it.
Christopher says he watched in fear as his best friend stepped into the hallway, gun drawn.
Merrill said he stayed in the bedroom. Chuck positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs down to the lower level. Mrs. Limbrick came into the house.
Chucky, are you home?
And Chuck did not respond. There was quite a bit of time before she came down to the lower level.
Christopher doesn't know what to do. He stays put. He stays in that room. And that works for me. Because consider, He's a follower, not a leader. He's frightened now. Chuck's got a gun, for God's sake, and he's going out in that hallway to confront his mother.
Christopher said he could hear the gun click. It's a heck of a noise to hear that hammer being pulled back, and it really reverberates, if you will, in a small room.
But the click of the hammer is nothing compared to what Christopher hears next.
Chucky?
He hears a gunshot. He hears Mrs. Limbrick say, "Chucky, I love you." He hears a second gunshot. He hears Mrs. Limbrick hit the floor.
According to Christopher, he then stepped out of the bedroom to find Betty Limbrick's dead body lying face down at the foot of the stairs.
He comes out. He can't believe it. There is a puddle of blood forming around her head, and Chuck looks at him and says, "Get some trash bags. We're gonna bag her up and dump her somewhere."
Christopher says he was overcome with fear and convinced his best friend to change course.
He says, no, somebody may have heard those shots and we need to get out of here. Chuck then decides, okay, let's turn this into a burglary situation. We can make this look like a burglary.
The boys then made their way upstairs, where Chuck took all of the cash from his mother's purse, along with her car keys.
They drove the car over to a nearby shopping center. Apparently, they felt, for some reason, they had to dispose of her car.
We gotta figure something out.
And they're sitting there talking about what their story will be. Chuck comes up with the idea of, I'll throw away my keys in a field, and then I can bring the neighbor in as a witness and say, can you let me into the house? I forgot my keys, so it looks like this discovery of a body and a burglary that's gone bad.
Kenda is blown away. By all accounts, Chuck Limbrick seemed like the perfect all-American kid.
Nobody thought that Chuck, the musician, the polite, quiet, good student, could kill his mother. How tragic is it that you bring somebody into the world and you nurture them and you love them and you raise them, and 15 years later they take you out of the world? How can that be? You look at that and you think, well, my. That's a little cold, isn't it, Chucky? You killed your own mother?
But what Kenda can't figure out is why. Christopher Morrow offers up an answer to that question as well.
He couldn't take it anymore.
Christopher talked at great length about how Chuck hated his mother, that she disciplined him, she wouldn't let him do what he wanted. There was always one confrontation after another.
Chuck really didn't like being disciplined, even things like just grounding, which is the type thing she was doing. And so there was sort of some resentment building up there.
Christopher recalls that right before the murder, Chuck said something truly chilling.
He said, if I don't shoot her, she's going to track us down and we're not going to be able to run away. She'll bring me back at some point. And so that was at least what his stated motive was at the time.
Chuck was vehement that his mother would find them and they needed to kill her to make sure that didn't happen.
Kenda has one last detail to sort out.
At the very end of this conversation, once we're clear on what happened, what'd you do with the gun? Well, they took it to Emerson Junior High School, which is where Chuck went to school, and they hid it in a dumpster under a cardboard box. We went to the dumpster at Emerson Junior, found the weapon still in a brown holster, 2 expended casings, 3 live, .357 Magnum. Chuck's fingerprints are found on the weapon. It is the weapon that registers to Christopher Morrow's father.
Kenda sets out to arrest Chuck Limbrick for the murder of his own mother.
He's at his mother's sister's house staying with them because, of course, his father's still on his way back from Louisiana and his mother's dead.
Hey, Chuck, you know why we're here, don't you?
When Kenda arrives, Chuck doesn't say a word. But Kenda doesn't need him to.
We search him, We pull off his left shoe, we pull off his left sock, and he has $114 in his sock. Money that came out of his mother's purse.
Kenda throws the cuffs on Chuck Limbrick.
You're under arrest for the murder of Betty Jean Limbrick, your mother.
And books him on the charge of first-degree murder.
We arrest him without comment, without incident, for the murder of Betty Jean Limbrick.
For the murder of Betty Jean Limbrick, Christopher Morrow receives 8 years in prison for his role as an accessory. For killing his own mother, however, Chuck's sentence is much steeper.
We, the jury, found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder.
We convicted Charles Limbrick Jr. of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison in the Colorado State Penitentiary at age 15. He was the youngest person ever placed in the Colorado State Penitentiary in the history of the state.
Even with the guilty verdict, those who knew Chuck Limbrick have a hard time coming to grips with the horrifying nature of the crime.
I could not believe that this young man would do that. He had just been hanging out over here at the band room after school. This couldn't have happened. I was in total disbelief, total disbelief.
Chuck is an example of the adolescent mind. He doesn't consider ramifications. He doesn't consider what happens next. He acts. Charles had an option. Don't shoot your mother to death, and we won't put you in the joint. But if you do that, then you're going to be in there forever.
The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., slicing through the quiet like a blade, and in that moment the night in West Texas stopped being ordinary, because when a call comes that late no one ever expects good news. Only the kind that leaves a stain you can't wash off. The kind that turns a house into a crime scene and a town into a whispering mouth. The voice on the other end was shaking, words tumbling over each other, saying there was a truck on County Road 114, engine still warm, driver's door hanging open, headlights burning into the mesquite, and no driver anywhere in sight. The wind was sharp, carrying dust across the asphalt, and under that wind there was something else, something wrong. The sense that whatever had happened here didn't want to be found. By sunrise, the road was sealed off with yellow tape, cameras circling like vultures, and a name was already being repeated in hushed tones at gas stations and breakfast counters, a name that would soon become synonymous with unanswered questions, with a year frozen in time, with a case people would later call solved even as the truth kept slipping through their fingers. The victim was 26. Born and raised in a place where everyone knows your truck, your dog, your parents' reputation, where anonymity doesn't exist and secrets have to work overtime to survive. Friends said he was steady, predictable, the kind of guy who called when he said he would, who never missed Sunday dinner, who didn't vanish without a reason. His truck was found less than 10 miles from his home, parked crooked, as if abandoned in a hurry, wallet still inside, phone missing, keys gone. No blood. No signs of a struggle that anyone could see in the first cold light of morning. Just the truck, humming quietly to itself, and the echo of a life that had been there minutes before and then suddenly wasn't. Deputies walked the roadside, boots crunching gravel, eyes scanning ditches and brush, radios crackling with half-finished thoughts. A search helicopter circled overhead, rotors chopping the air, while volunteers fanned out across fields that stretched flat and unforgiving to the horizon. They found nothing. Not a shoe. Not a scrap of fabric. Not a footprint clear enough to swear by. It was as if the ground had opened and swallowed him whole. By noon, the town knew. By evening, the town was afraid. Parents locked doors that had never needed locks. Ranchers loaded rifles into pickups not because they expected trouble, but because fear demands a ritual, something solid to hold on to. The local paper ran a banner headline that screamed mystery, and beneath it a photo pulled from a driver's license, a smiling face that suddenly felt accusatory, as if asking why no one had seen this coming. Detectives from the county and the state converged, clipboards in hand, measuring tape snapping, cameras flashing. They talked about timelines and last sightings, about cell phone pings that went silent in a dead zone of scrubland and oil pumps. They talked about the bar he'd stopped at after work, the beer he'd barely touched, the argument no one could quite confirm, but everyone suddenly remembered. They talked about Texas being big, about how easy it is to disappear if someone wants you to, or if you want to disappear yourself, though no one who knew him believed the second option for a second. The investigation moved fast at first, fueled by urgency and the unspoken pressure of a community watching every move. Tips poured in, some earnest, some unhinged. A waitress swore she'd seen him with a stranger in a black sedan. A trucker claimed a man matching his description flagged him down miles away, bleeding, then vanished into the dark when headlights approached. A ranch hand found a boot print near a dry creek bed and insisted it wasn't local. Each lead sparked hope, then fizzled under scrutiny, leaving behind that hollow thud investigators know too well. The phone records told a partial story, calls made, calls missed, the last outgoing call cutting off mid-ring. Surveillance cameras offered grainy nothingness, shadows that could be anything or nothing at all. Days turned into weeks, the search grids expanded, and still the land kept its secret. As the case cooled, theories heated up. Whispers grew sharper, more personal. People started pointing fingers not at strangers, but at neighbors, co-workers, friends. A co-worker who owed him money. A former girlfriend who had moved away suddenly and without explanation. A bar regular with a temper and a criminal record that looked ugly on paper. Detectives followed these threads carefully, knowing how easily a rumor can harden into a false confession in the court of public opinion. Polygraphs were administered in quiet rooms that smelled like coffee and stress. Alibis were checked, then checked again. Nothing stuck. Every potential suspect had a hole in the story, but none big enough to drive a charge through. The district attorney wanted more than suspicion, he wanted something that would survive a courtroom. It never came. Months later, a hunter found something that reignited everything, a shallow depression in the earth, disturbed soil, a piece of clothing half buried and sun-bleached. For a moment, the town held its breath. For a moment, reporters crowded the site, microphones extended, waiting for confirmation that the waiting was over. Forensics said no. The fabric didn't match. The disturbance was old, unrelated, just another cruel coincidence in a case that seemed built on them. Hope curdled into frustration. Billboards went up along highways, a familiar face staring out over miles of nothing, phone numbers printed in bold. Candlelight vigils flickered and died out as seasons changed. People moved on because life demands it, but they did so with a shadow over their shoulder. Years passed. New detectives inherited old files, boxes heavy with paper and disappointment. They reread interviews, circled phrases, wondered what had been missed in the fog of those first frantic days. Technology advanced. DNA databases grew. Cold case units promised second chances. And then, quietly, almost anticlimactically, an arrest was announced. A press release went out, using words like closure and resolution, and the headline the next morning declared the case solved. The suspect was a man already behind bars on unrelated charges, his name unfamiliar to most of the town, his connection to the victim thin, but technically plausible. Prosecutors spoke carefully, outlining a narrative built on circumstantial evidence and a confession that had come after hours of questioning, a confession later recanted, then reaffirmed, then blurred by claims of coercion. The family stood behind podiums, faces tight, thanking law enforcement while their eyes betrayed something unresolved. In living rooms and diners, people read the articles and nodded, because that is what you do when told a mystery is over, but the nods were slow, uncertain. The details didn't sit right. The timeline felt forced. Key questions remained unanswered, brushed aside in favor of finality. The truck, the missing phone, the complete absence of physical evidence tying the suspect to that lonely stretch of road, all of it lingered like an aftertaste. Online forums lit up with armchair detectives dissecting court documents, pointing out inconsistencies, resurrecting old theories that refused to die. The term solved began to feel like a label applied for comfort rather than truth. And so the case exists now in a strange limbo, officially closed, emotionally raw, a story told in past tense that refuses to stay there. On County Road 114, the asphalt has been repaved, the mesquite trimmed back, but at night, when headlights cut through the dark, locals still slow down, still glance toward the shoulder where a truck once sat idling without its driver. They remember the call at 2:17 a.m., the way the town held its breath, the years of not knowing, and the uneasy relief that came with an answer that didn't quite answer anything at all. The file may say solved, but the silence of that road says otherwise, and in that silence the question still hangs, heavy and unanswered, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. Time didn't heal anything, it only rearranged the pain, spreading it thin across years until people forgot how sharp it had once been, but the case kept breathing in the background, inhaling every rumor, every late-night tip, every anonymous letter slipped under a newsroom door, and long after the cameras left, long after the yellow tape was peeled away and tossed into evidence lockers, the town lived with a low, constant hum of unease, the sense that something unfinished was still moving just beneath the surface. Detectives came and went, promotions, retirements, transfers, each new name penciled onto the file bringing a brief flicker of hope that this time, finally, someone would see what others had missed. The box itself grew heavier, thick with transcripts, photographs fading at the edges, maps marked and remarked until the ink bled through. Every few years, a new theory would flare up, bright and insistent, only to collapse under its own weight, leaving behind ash and disappointment. One investigator, younger than the case itself when it began, approached it without the emotional calluses the others had developed. He read everything out of order, deliberately, refusing to let the established narrative guide his eyes. He noticed patterns that weren't obvious before, small inconsistencies in statements that had been dismissed as nerves or faulty memory, time stamps that didn't quite align, distances that seemed trivial until you drove them yourself in the dead of night. He drove County Road 114 again and again, at different hours, in different weather, listening to how sound carried, watching how headlights revealed and concealed, imagining the fear of standing there alone with nothing but scrubland and darkness for company. He wondered why the truck had been left running. He wondered who would know that stretch of road well enough to choose it and why. The phone records, old and clumsy by modern standards, were re-examined with new software, patterns teased out of what once looked like noise. Calls clustered around certain towers, certain hours, a rhythm that suggested routine, familiarity. The missing phone became an obsession. No body, no phone, no definitive crime scene, just a vehicle paused mid-sentence. Informants were leaned on harder this time, old favors called in, prison whispers listened to with cautious patience. It was in one of those whispers that a name resurfaced, barely audible at first, spoken with the casual cruelty of someone trading information for comfort. The man was already incarcerated, a career criminal with a history of violence that fit neatly into the kind of profile everyone wishes these cases have, because profiles are comforting, because they imply order. He had drifted through the area in 2003, no fixed address, no one to vouch for him, a ghost passing through another ghost story. When detectives sat across from him in the interview room, the air was thick with anticipation and skepticism. He smiled too easily, eyes darting, posture relaxed in a way that suggested he thought he knew how this dance went. He talked freely at first, offering half-truths, then contradictions, testing how much they knew, how much they didn't. Hours passed. Coffee cooled. Tapes rolled. Eventually, something shifted. His voice dropped. Details emerged, vivid and specific in ways that made the room go quiet. He described the road, the truck, the fear. He said things only someone there would know, or at least that's how it sounded in the moment, the words clicking into place like a long-awaited answer. When he signed the statement, the ink pressed hard into the paper, detectives felt the familiar surge of relief, the intoxicating belief that the puzzle was finally complete. But relief is fragile. Almost immediately, the cracks began to show. He recanted, claiming coercion, claiming he'd been fed details, claiming he'd said what he thought they wanted to hear. Defense attorneys pounced, filing motions, dissecting the interrogation minute by minute, arguing that desperation had clouded judgment, that a closed case was being forced into existence. The absence of physical evidence loomed larger than ever. No DNA. No fingerprints. No phone recovered. The prosecution leaned heavily on circumstantial threads, weaving a story that made sense on paper, but felt thin when held up to the light. Still, the pressure to move forward was immense. Years of waiting demanded an ending, any ending, and in a courtroom far from that quiet road, the narrative hardened into something official. The trial was a study in restraint and spectacle, prosecutors careful with their language, defense attorneys aggressive, painting a picture of a system eager to declare victory regardless of the cost. The victim's family sat through it all, absorbing every word, every exhibit, searching faces for sincerity. Outside, reporters filed stories that balanced caution with certainty, headlines declaring progress, resolution, justice. The verdict, when it came, landed with a dull thud rather than an explosion, a conclusion that satisfied procedure if not emotion. The sentence was handed down, the gavel fell, and the case was stamped closed, the date of disappearance replaced with a date of conviction. In the aftermath, the town tried to exhale. Some embraced the outcome, grateful for something solid to hold onto after so many years of uncertainty. Others remained uneasy, their doubts whispered rather than shouted, shared over kitchen tables and late-night drinks. They talked about alternative suspects who'd never been fully cleared, about sightings that didn't match the official timeline, about the way the investigation had narrowed too quickly once a confession was on the table. Online, the debate was louder, more relentless, fueled by documents uploaded and analyzed by strangers who cared enough to dig, but not enough to live with the consequences. Podcasts picked up the story, reintroducing it to a national audience, framing it as a solved cold case with unresolved questions, the perfect paradox for an audience hungry for ambiguity. The road itself became a quiet shrine of sorts, not marked by flowers or crosses, but by memory. Locals could point to the exact spot without thinking, their hands drifting instinctively when they drove past. At night, the darkness there felt heavier, as if it remembered. New residents learned the story the way you learn local folklore, pieced together from different tellings, each emphasizing different villains, different failures. The official version became just one of many, existing alongside theories that refused to die, each one sustained by the same absence that had defined the case from the beginning. Years later, when asked if the case was truly solved, the lead investigator paused longer than expected. He spoke about evidence, about legal standards, about the difference between truth and what can be proven. He avoided absolutes. He said the system had done its job, that a jury had decided, that the file was closed. But his eyes, just for a second, betrayed a flicker of something unresolved. In the end, perhaps that is the legacy of this case, not the conviction, not the headlines, but the lingering sense that something essential is still missing, tucked away somewhere between that silent stretch of Texas road and the human need for answers. The night the truck was found remains suspended in time, a question mark stretching across decades, reminding anyone who listens closely that some stories resist endings, no matter how badly we want them. After the verdict, silence moved in like fog, slow and suffocating, filling every space where questions used to echo, and for a while it worked, at least on the surface, because official closure has a way of muting outrage, of convincing people to pack away their doubts and label them unhealthy, unproductive, disrespectful to the idea of justice. The courthouse emptied, the microphones disappeared, and the man convicted of the crime was absorbed back into the prison system, another number stitched onto another uniform, his name filed under resolved. But cases like this don't end cleanly, they leak. They seep into conversations years later, into casual remarks that begin with "I don't know why," or "it never sat right with me." The story didn't die. It just went underground. In the months that followed, small details resurfaced, the kind that had been overshadowed by the drama of a confession and a trial. A mechanic remembered seeing the victim's truck days earlier, idling strangely, the engine sputtering as if something was wrong. A bartender admitted she'd been pressured to stick to her original statement, even though she couldn't swear to the time anymore. A former deputy, now retired and a little looser with his words, mentioned an early lead that had gone nowhere too fast, involving a local with deep roots and deeper connections, someone no one wanted to look at too closely. None of it was enough to reopen anything, but together it formed a low murmur, a background noise that refused to fade. The missing phone remained the most haunting absence. In 2003, it was just another device, clunky and forgettable, but in hindsight it became a ghost, a pocket-sized witness that might have known everything. Investigators had searched landfills, traced resale routes, monitored pawn shops, all without success. Years later, when technology had advanced enough to make recovery seem almost magical, it was too late. If the phone had ever been powered on again, it hadn't been where anyone could see. The idea that it was still out there, buried, destroyed, or sitting in a drawer somewhere, gnawed at people who followed the case closely. It symbolized everything that had gone missing that night, not just a man, but clarity. The convicted man's story continued to shift over time, each retelling slightly different, slightly more self-serving. In letters to journalists, he claimed innocence, then partial involvement, then a version where he was present but not responsible. He accused unnamed accomplices, hinted at deals gone wrong, suggested that powerful people had steered the investigation away from the truth. Most dismissed it as the noise of a man with nothing to lose, but a few passages were unsettlingly specific, naming locations and routines that hadn't been publicized. When confronted with these inconsistencies, officials shrugged, pointing to the verdict, to the jury's decision, to the fact that reopening the case would help no one. Justice, they implied, had already been served. But justice is not the same as certainty, and the family knew that better than anyone. They lived with a contradiction that tore at them quietly, gratitude for the effort, the attention, the eventual resolution, and a persistent ache that something fundamental was still wrong. They avoided interviews for a long time, tired of being symbols in someone else's narrative, but when they did speak, their words were careful, measured, heavy with restraint. They said they trusted the process. They said they believed in the outcome. And then, sometimes, they paused, eyes drifting, as if listening to a question they didn't want to hear out loud. Cold case experts weighed in from afar, analyzing transcripts and evidence lists like archaeologists sifting through ruins. They talked about false confessions, about the psychology of interrogation, about how memory can be contaminated by suggestion. They pointed out how the absence of physical evidence doesn't prove innocence, but it does demand caution. The case became a teaching tool in criminal justice courses, an example of how resolution can coexist with doubt, how a file can be closed while a story remains open-ended. Students debated it passionately, detached from the human cost, arguing theory while the real consequences played out quietly back in Texas. Meanwhile, County Road 114 became something of a landmark for a new generation of true crime tourists, people who drove out of their way to stand where the truck had been found, to feel the wind, to imagine the moment when everything went wrong. They took photos, posted them online, speculated freely, sometimes recklessly. Locals watched this with a mix of irritation and resignation, aware that their tragedy had become content, fodder for endless analysis, by people who would never fully understand the weight of living with it. Still, even among the speculation, some questions persisted with stubborn consistency, questions that no amount of theorizing could erase. Why that road? Why that time? Why no witnesses, in a place where nothing happens without someone noticing? Why leave the truck running, a detail so odd it felt intentional? Was it a mistake, a panicked oversight, or a calculated distraction? The official narrative offered answers, but they felt too neat, too eager to tie a bow around chaos. Alternative theories painted a messier picture, involving multiple people, accidental death, cover-ups born not of malice but of fear. None could be proven. All lingered. Years stretched into decades, and the case aged into legend, its edges smoothed by repetition. Younger residents knew it as a story their parents told, a warning about trusting the night, about how quickly normal can fracture. Law enforcement agencies pointed to it as a success, a demonstration of persistence, of not giving up. Both could be true at the same time, and that duality became part of the case's identity. Solved, but not settled. Answered, but not understood. Every so often, a new tip would come in, sparked by a dream, a deathbed confession, a sudden memory jolted loose by age or regret. Each one was logged, reviewed, politely dismissed. The machinery of the justice system had moved on, its attention consumed by fresher crimes, louder tragedies. There was no appetite to reopen old wounds without something undeniably new. And so the case remained as it was, frozen in a peculiar state of official certainty and communal doubt. On anniversaries, local stations would rerun old footage, the familiar images stirring something uneasy. The victim's face, still young in the photo, seemed to grow more out of place with each passing year, a reminder of time stolen and time wasted. Commentators used phrases like haunting and lingering questions, careful not to challenge the verdict outright, but careful not to endorse it too enthusiastically either. The balance was delicate, a dance between respect and skepticism. In private moments, those closest to the case admitted what they wouldn't say publicly. That they sometimes imagined alternative endings. That they wondered if the truth had been simpler or more complicated than anyone could accept. That they feared the real story might never be known, not because it was impossible to uncover, but because the moment to uncover it had passed, buried under procedure, fatigue, and the human desire to move on. And so the night of the disappearance remains vivid in a way the years that followed do not. The empty road. The running engine. The sense of interruption, of a life cut mid-thought. Officially, the case is over. On paper, it has an ending. But in the minds of those who remember, those who still feel the weight of that unanswered first question, it continues, looping endlessly, a reminder that some truths don't announce themselves with verdicts or headlines. They linger, unresolved, waiting in the dark, asking to be noticed one more time. The longer the case sat in its official grave, the more it seemed to attract the restless, the people who couldn't accept stillness where there had once been chaos, the ones who believed that if you stared long enough at the past it might blink first. They came from everywhere, journalists between assignments, former cops with too much time and too many memories, online sleuths armed with spreadsheets and conviction. They all circled the same absence, that blank space where certainty should have lived, and each of them, in their own way, tried to fill it. Some did it with facts, others with imagination, and the line between the two blurred until even those closest to the truth struggled to tell them apart. A reporter from out of state arrived quietly, renting a car, not announcing her presence, spending days in diners and bars where conversations flowed more freely after the second cup of coffee, or the third drink. She didn't ask about the verdict. She asked about the night. Where were you when you heard? What did you think at first? Who did you suspect before anyone told you who to suspect? People answered cautiously at first, eyes scanning the room, voices low, but familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort breeds confession. Patterns emerged, not of guilt, but of perception. The same names surfaced again and again, not as accused criminals, but as figures who loomed too large in the background to be ignored. The reporter wrote nothing down in front of them, relying on memory, on the way certain details lingered longer than others. She requested access to public records, combing through logs and dispatch calls, noting response times, inconsistencies so small they'd been invisible under the weight of urgency. Why did it take this long for backup to arrive? Why was this potential witness never formally interviewed? Why did this lead die quietly without explanation? None of it proved anything, but together it suggested a story less streamlined than the one presented in court. When she reached out to officials for comment, the responses were polite, firm, rehearsed. The case was closed. The conviction stood. Reopening it would serve no purpose. Purpose, she thought, is a matter of perspective. Elsewhere, a retired detective, who had worked the case briefly in its early days, began speaking more openly, his loyalty to the institution softened by time and distance. He described a chaotic investigation, departments stepping on each other's toes, egos clashing, pressure mounting as days passed without results. He admitted mistakes, not criminal ones, but human ones, assumptions made too quickly, avenues abandoned because they felt uncomfortable, resources stretched thin. He didn't name names. He didn't accuse. He simply painted a picture of imperfection, of a system doing its best under circumstances it barely understood. To some, his honesty was refreshing. To others, it was unsettling, because it suggested that the truth might have slipped away not through malice, but through haste. The land itself began to tell a story, if you listened carefully. Environmental changes over the years altered the landscape around County Road 114, erosion reshaping ditches, construction redirecting runoff, new developments cutting into what had once been open scrub. Experts speculated about evidence that could have been lost not to a perpetrator, but to time, washed away or buried beyond recovery. The idea that the answer might have been there all along, inches below the surface, and was now gone forever, added another layer of quiet tragedy. Nature, unlike the justice system, doesn't care about closure. The convicted man continued to exist at the edge of the narrative, a constant, uncomfortable presence. He filed appeals. They were denied. He gave interviews to anyone willing to listen, his story evolving with each telling, adapting to the questions asked. Some saw manipulation. Others saw desperation. A few saw fragments of something more complicated. When asked directly about the missing phone, his answers were vague, evasive, contradictory. He claimed ignorance, then hinted at destruction, then suggested someone else had taken it. Each version raised more questions than it answered. Officials dismissed it as noise. But noise, in a case built on silence, had power. The victim's family marked time differently. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays came and went with an empty chair that no verdict could fill. They tried to rebuild, to focus on what remained rather than what was lost, but the case followed them, resurfacing whenever a new article appeared, whenever a podcast episode reignited public interest. They learned to navigate interviews carefully, to balance gratitude with guardedness. Privately, they wrestled with doubt, not always about the conviction, but about the unknowable details, the final moments they would never truly understand. Closure, they learned, is not a switch you flip. It's a negotiation you revisit over and over. In academic circles, the case became shorthand, cited in papers and conferences as an example of narrative momentum, the way a story, once it gains traction, can carry investigators and jurors alike toward a conclusion that feels inevitable. Scholars debated the ethics of declaring a case solved when key questions remain, arguing about the harm of uncertainty versus the harm of finality built on fragile foundations. The discussions were theoretical, abstract, but their implications were painfully real. Somewhere between the footnotes and the panel discussions was a man who never came home. Every so often, someone claimed to have a breakthrough. A new witness. A forgotten diary. A map with markings that suddenly made sense. These moments flared brightly online, drawing attention, hope, skepticism in equal measure, then faded when scrutiny revealed familiar flaws. Confirmation bias. Misremembered timelines. Wishful thinking. Each false dawn left the community a little more tired, a little more cynical, but also unwilling to stop looking entirely. There was comfort, strange as it sounds, in the search itself. It kept the story alive, and as long as the story lived, so did the possibility, however remote, of truth. The road remained unchanged in its indifference. Cars passed. Seasons shifted. At night, the wind still whispered through the mesquite, carrying with it the weight of a moment frozen in time. People who drove it regularly described a sensation they couldn't quite articulate, a tightening in the chest, a heightened awareness, as if the place itself demanded attention. Rational minds dismissed it as imagination, as the power of suggestion. But emotion is not rational, and neither is memory. Law enforcement agencies pointed to the case when discussing the importance of perseverance, of not abandoning investigations simply because they go cold. And yet, in quieter moments, some acknowledged the paradox, that perseverance, when coupled with pressure, can sometimes push a narrative forward before it's ready. The difference between solving a case and understanding it is subtle, but crucial, and this case straddled that line uncomfortably. As the years continued to pile up, the question shifted from who did it to whether anyone would ever truly know. Evidence degrades. Memories warp. Witnesses die. Opportunities close. The window for absolute clarity narrows until it becomes a sliver, then nothing at all. What remains is interpretation, belief, and the uneasy coexistence of multiple truths. Official truth. Personal truth. Communal truth. The story, told and retold, began to lose its sharp edges, but not its gravity. New listeners encountered it without the emotional baggage of those who had lived through it, and for them, the unresolved elements were intriguing rather than painful. They debated freely, speculated boldly, unaware of the cost of that freedom. For the town, for the family, for those who had been there at the beginning, the mystery was not entertainment. It was an open wound that had learned to function. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is not the unanswered questions themselves, but how easily they were set aside in the name of resolution. How quickly a narrative can harden into fact once stamped with authority. How silence can be mistaken for peace. The file may be closed, the verdict final, but the story refuses to rest, lingering in the margins, in the spaces between official statements and lived experience, reminding anyone who pays attention that some cases are solved only on paper, while the truth remains out there, unclaimed, waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to disturb the quiet once more. There is a moment in every long-running investigation, when the story stops, belonging to the people involved and starts belonging to time itself, when years layer over facts, so thickly that memory becomes sediment, and digging through it risks collapsing the whole structure. That moment came quietly for this case, not with a headline or a press conference, but with fatigue. The fatigue of detectives, who had asked every question they knew how to ask. The fatigue of a family who had learned that answers, when they arrive late, rarely arrive clean. The fatigue of a town that had spent too long living between certainty and doubt. And yet, beneath that exhaustion, something kept stirring, a refusal to fully accept that this was as good as it would ever get. A former friend of the victim, someone who had drifted away after the disappearance under the weight of suspicion and grief, finally spoke years later, not because he had new information, but because the silence had become heavier than the risk of talking. He described the victim in small, intimate ways the case files never captured. The nervous habit of tapping the steering wheel, the way he avoided confrontation, the routes he preferred when driving at night. He insisted the official version didn't match the person he knew, that the idea of him stopping willingly on that road, getting out of the truck without a fight, felt wrong at a fundamental level. It wasn't evidence. It was intuition. But intuition, when repeated enough, starts to feel like its own kind of truth. Others began revisiting the hours leading up to the disappearance, scrutinizing them with almost obsessive precision. The bus stop that was supposed to be insignificant suddenly felt pivotal. Who was there that night? Who left early? Who lingered? Receipts were re-examined, timestamps compared to witness recollections that had hardened into certainty over time, even though memory is anything but stable. One discrepancy kept resurfacing, small but stubborn, the window of time between the victim leaving the bar and the truck being found. It was narrow enough to suggest something sudden, impulsive, yet wide enough to allow for movement, for choices, for intervention. That ambiguity became fertile ground for speculation, and speculation, unchecked, grows teeth. The idea of multiple people involved gained traction not because it was dramatic, but because it explained too much to ignore. The absence of a struggle. The lack of witnesses. The clean scene. The missing phone. One person acting alone would have had to be extraordinarily lucky, or extraordinarily prepared. More than one person meant coordination, familiarity, shared risk. It also meant silence, and silence on that scale is rare unless it's protected by fear, loyalty, or something even stronger. The town, once reluctant to entertain such thoughts, began to whisper them more openly as distance from the original shock made honesty easier than politeness. Attention drifted toward social circles that had never been fully untangled, overlapping worlds of work, leisure, and quiet rivalry. Old grudges resurfaced, arguments reinterpreted with the benefit of hindsight. None of it pointed cleanly to a solution, but it complicated the narrative enough to make the official story feel increasingly fragile. Law enforcement responded by reiterating the strength of the conviction, emphasizing that justice is built on what can be proven, not on what feels plausible. It was a reasonable stance. It was also unsatisfying. The prison interviews continued. The convicted man aged visibly, his hair thinning, his confidence eroding. In later conversations, he spoke less like a manipulator, and more like someone drowning in contradictions. He described the night with flashes of clarity that faded as quickly as they appeared, moments of certainty followed by confusion. He claimed guilt in one breath and denied it in the next, as if trying on different versions of himself to see which one hurt less. Psychologists who reviewed transcripts suggested a fractured narrative, a mind under pressure filling gaps with borrowed details. Others argued the opposite, that inconsistency was a tactic, a way to keep attention focused on him rather than on anyone else who might have been involved. Both interpretations were possible. Neither could be proven. What lingered most, for those who paid attention, was how little had actually changed since 2003. Despite technological advances, despite renewed interest, the core facts remained stubbornly static. A man disappeared. His truck was found running. A phone vanished. No body. No physical trail. Everything else was scaffolding built around that void. The conviction added weight, authority, but it did not fill the space. It merely framed it, labeling the absence as resolved. The family grappled with a private question they never voiced publicly. If the conviction were overturned tomorrow, would that bring peace, or reopen wounds they had worked so hard to manage? The answer shifted depending on the day. Some mornings, the idea of renewed investigation felt hopeful, like light cracking through a door. Other days, it felt cruel, an invitation to relive the worst moments of their lives in the service of a truth that might still remain elusive. They learned that closure is not a destination, but a posture, something you adjust to survive. Meanwhile, the case began influencing others in subtle ways. Young detectives cited it as motivation, a reminder of why attention to detail matters, why assumptions can be dangerous. Advocates for interrogation reform referenced it when arguing for stricter safeguards, for recording protocols, for caution around confessions unsupported by evidence. In that sense, the case continued to have impact, shaping conversations far beyond the county where it began. It mattered. It just didn't make sense. Late one night, years after the verdict, a call came into a tip line, the kind that usually leads nowhere. The voice was distorted, the story vague, but it mentioned a location that hadn't been searched thoroughly, a pocket of land overlooked, because it straddled jurisdictions, because responsibility blurred at its edges. The tip was logged, reviewed, and quietly investigated. Nothing was found. Or at least, nothing that could be acknowledged publicly. The silence that followed was interpreted in different ways depending on who you asked. To some, it confirmed there was nothing left to find. To others, it hinted at something deliberately left untouched. As the 20th anniversary approached, the story resurfaced once more, framed as a retrospective, a look back at a case that had defined an era for the town. New segments juxtaposed old footage with new interviews, the contrast stark. Faces once young now lined. Voices once urgent now subdued. The word solved was used carefully, often paired with qualifiers, as if even those telling the story felt the need to hedge. Viewers responded with a familiar mix of empathy and suspicion, their reactions a mirror of the community's long-standing ambivalence. In the end, the most persistent question is not about guilt or innocence, but about certainty. How much uncertainty a system can tolerate before it declares an answer sufficient. How much doubt a community can carry without fracturing. How much ambiguity a family can live with while still moving forward. This case sits at the intersection of those limits, testing them quietly, relentlessly. County Road 114 remains just a road. There is no marker. No sign. No official acknowledgement of what happened there. And yet, for those who know, it is weighted with significance, a place where time folded in on itself, where a life diverged from expectation and never returned. Cars still pass. Engines still idle. Phones still lose signal. Ordinary moments stack on top of extraordinary ones, slowly burying them. Officially, the case is solved. The paperwork says so. The sentence confirms it. But stories do not obey paperwork, and memory does not respect verdicts. The truth, whatever it is, exists somewhere between what was decided and what was lived, between the need for answers and the reality of their absence. And as long as people continue to ask, continue to wonder, continue to feel that quiet tightening in their chest when they think about that night, the case will never fully rest. It will remain what it has always been at its core, a moment interrupted, a silence unexplained, a question still echoing in the dark, waiting to see if anyone, someday, will finally hear it clearly enough to answer. As the years stretched further away from the night it began, the case stopped being measured in days or months and started being measured in absences, the absence of proof, of certainty, of a body, of a moment that could be pointed to and declared the end. What remained was a long corridor of maybes, and people walked it alone, carrying their own versions of the truth like private burdens. Law enforcement moved on in practice if not in principle, budgets redirected, priorities reshuffled, but the file never disappeared completely. It sat there, dormant but alive, waiting for something strong enough to wake it. That something, when it came, did not arrive as evidence, but as doubt from within. A junior prosecutor, years removed from the original trial, was assigned to review old convictions as part of a routine integrity audit. The task was procedural, almost boring, meant to confirm that boxes had been checked, that standards had been met. When she reached this case, she expected the same. Instead, she found herself slowing down, rereading passages, pausing at moments others had rushed past. The confession troubled her, not because confessions are rare or inherently suspect, but because this one seemed to float, unattached to anything solid. It leaned heavily on narrative rather than corroboration, on sequence rather than substance. She noted it quietly, flagged it internally, and moved on, but the discomfort lingered. Around the same time, advances in data analysis prompted a re-examination of old cell tower records across multiple cold cases. The technology was imperfect, retrospective, but it offered patterns that hadn't been visible before. When analysts overlaid the victim's last known phone activity with movement patterns from others in the area that night, something unexpected appeared, a cluster of signals that suggested proximity where none had been officially acknowledged. The margin of error was wide enough to dismiss it, and officially, it was dismissed. But informally, among those who saw it, the image stuck. It hinted at company when the story insisted on solitude. Those patterns reignited interest in a name that had drifted in and out of the case for years without ever fully landing. A local man, well-known, well-connected, someone whose presence in the victim's orbit had been minimized early on, categorized as irrelevant, then forgotten. He had an alibi that was never fully tested, anchored by friends and routines rather than timestamps and receipts. Revisiting it now felt dangerous, not legally, but socially. Accusations, even implied ones, have consequences, especially in places where reputations are inherited and memory is long. Investigators debated quietly, weighing the cost of reopening old wounds against the possibility that something essential had been overlooked. The debate never became public. Officially, nothing changed. Unofficially, conversations shifted. The certainty that had settled after the conviction began to thin, not enough to collapse, but enough to feel unstable. The idea that the wrong story might have been told, even unintentionally, introduced a new kind of fear, not of crime, but of error. Error that couldn't be corrected without unraveling years of declarations, without admitting that closure had been premature. The convicted man sensed the shift before anyone acknowledged it. In prison, news travels strangely, distorted but persistent. He began writing more letters, longer ones, more detailed, naming names he had only hinted at before. Some were dismissed outright as revenge or manipulation. Others were quietly read, compared, set aside. In one letter, he described a confrontation that didn't match the prosecution's timeline, but aligned disturbingly well with the new data patterns. When questioned about it later, he retracted it, then claimed memory failure, then accused investigators of twisting his words. The oscillation was exhausting, infuriating, but it also underscored a truth no one wanted to face. This was a story no one fully controlled anymore. The family watched all of this from a distance, aware that something was happening, but rarely told exactly what. They had learned that information often brought more pain than relief, that updates came with conditions, with expectations of reaction, of gratitude, of restraint. They asked fewer questions now, not because they didn't care, but because caring had become a careful act, something that required boundaries to survive. Still, late at night, they revisited the same images, the same what-ifs, wondering whether the life they lost was also buried under someone else's mistake. Community reaction was muted but intense, a low-level anxiety that spread quietly. People revisited their own memories of that year, aligning them with new rumors, testing them for consistency. Some felt vindicated, believing their long-held doubts were finally justified. Others felt threatened, defensive, protective of the narrative they had accepted. The idea that the truth might be more complex than a single villain was unsettling. Complexity offers no clean release, no moment of triumph, only an ongoing negotiation with uncertainty. Media outlets sensed the shift and began circling again, careful this time, aware of the backlash that comes with reopening supposedly settled stories. Language became cautious, conditional. Phrases like new questions and emerging concerns replaced declarations. The case was framed not as wrong, but as fragile. Viewers responded accordingly, divided between those who demanded answers and those who accused the coverage of stirring unnecessary doubt. The tension was familiar, a replay of the original aftermath, but quieter, more restrained. Behind closed doors, officials debated the unthinkable. What if reopening the case led nowhere? What if it only confirmed how much time had been lost, how many opportunities missed? What if it exposed flaws that could not be fixed? The justice system, built on finality, struggles with revision. Admitting uncertainty is one thing. Acting on it is another. And yet, the longer they waited, the more that uncertainty pressed in, demanding acknowledgement. The land, indifferent as ever, continued to change. New construction erased old paths. Fences were erected where none had stood before. The physical world moved forward, unconcerned with unresolved narratives. Any evidence that might still exist grew harder to imagine, let alone recover. Time, relentless and impartial, became the final adversary, not just of truth, but of memory itself. On the anniversary of the disappearance, a small group gathered quietly near the road, not for cameras, not for speeches, but for themselves. They stood in the wind, listening to passing cars, sharing nothing more than presence. No one spoke about guilt or innocence. They spoke about loss, about the strange way a single night can ripple outward across decades, shaping lives in ways no verdict can undo. In that moment, the distinction between solved and unsolved felt irrelevant. What mattered was the absence, the silence that had followed and never fully lifted. Officially, no action was announced. No case was reopened. No conviction was challenged. But something had shifted, subtly, irrevocably. The certainty that once anchored the story was gone, replaced by a more honest, more troubling acknowledgement of complexity. The idea that answers might exist beyond the ones already given became harder to dismiss. The case now lives in a different kind of cold, not the cold of abandonment, but the cold of unresolved possibility. It is no longer a question of whether someone will solve it, but whether anyone will dare to admit that it may never be truly solved at all. The label remains. The paperwork stands. But beneath it, the story continues to breathe, uneven and restless, waiting for the moment when silence gives way to something else, whether that something is truth, or simply the courage to say that certainty was never really there to begin with. What unsettled people most wasn't the possibility that the wrong man had been convicted, it was the creeping realization that the truth, whatever it was, had learned how to survive without needing to be acknowledged. It existed comfortably in the margins, fed by doubt, protected by time, growing stronger every time someone tried to ignore it. The case had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer just about one night in 2003. It had become about everything that followed, every decision made in its shadow, every silence mistaken for certainty. Inside law enforcement, the conversations grew quieter, more coded. No emails. No official memos. Just hallway exchanges, doors closed a little too carefully, phrases that trailed off before reaching conclusions. There was an understanding, unspoken but shared, that reopening the case formally would mean more than revisiting evidence. It would mean revisiting reputations. Careers built on the success of a solved cold case suddenly felt less stable. No one wanted to be the person who pulled that thread and watched everything unravel. Yet the thread kept pulling itself. A former dispatcher, retired and battling illness, asked to speak with a journalist. She had been on duty the night the truck was found, the night voices came through the radio clipped and urgent, the night protocol bent under pressure. Her memory wasn't perfect, she admitted that freely, but one detail had never sat right with her. A call logged as routine that hadn't sounded routine at all. A voice she didn't recognize, calm in a way that felt rehearsed, reporting something before it should have been known. At the time, she'd chalked it up to nerves, to the confusion of the moment. Years later, with nothing left to lose, it felt heavier. The call had been investigated. Of course it had. Cleared, documented, explained away as a misunderstanding. But explanations age poorly. When the journalist cross-referenced the timestamp with other records, small discrepancies emerged. Seconds, maybe minutes. Not enough to scream conspiracy, but enough to whisper opportunity. The story that had once seemed linear began to warp, bending subtly around points no one wanted to touch. Rumors resurfaced about a gathering that had taken place earlier that evening, not at the bar, but somewhere quieter, somewhere unofficial. A place where phones didn't get service anyway. Where people knew each other well enough not to leave records. The victim had supposedly been there, briefly, unconfirmed, unproven, a footnote at best. But footnotes have a way of growing when you read closely. Those who denied it did so quickly, emphatically. Those who didn't remember did so conveniently. The absence of memory became its own pattern. The convicted man's name receded slightly as others began to dominate the whispered narrative. Not as suspects, not formally, but as presences. People who had been nearby. People who knew the roads. People who understood how to make something look accidental, or at least ambiguous enough to buy time. Time had done the rest. It always does. Psychologists studying the case spoke about something they called narrative gravity, the force that pulls all new information toward an existing conclusion unless actively resisted. Once a story is told often enough, it becomes easier to fit facts into it than to question it. The confession, flawed as it was, had anchored the case so firmly that everything else had been interpreted in its orbit. Breaking free of that gravity required not just evidence, but courage, and courage is harder to measure than proof. The family felt the shift too, though it came to them filtered, distorted, softened by intermediaries who meant well. They were told there were questions, reviews, ongoing interest. No one said the word mistake. No one said wrong. But the implication hovered, heavy and unresolved. They struggled with anger they didn't want to feel. Anger at the system. Anger at the man convicted. Anger at themselves for still hoping. Hope, after all, had cost them dearly. At night, the mother replayed the same mental image she'd carried for years. Her son stepping out of the truck, confused, expecting something ordinary, maybe a conversation, maybe a misunderstanding. She had tried to replace it with the official version, with the comfort of finality, but the image resisted revision. It was stubborn. Like the truth. Online, the discourse grew sharper. Forums split into factions, not over guilt, but over belief. Belief in the system versus belief in intuition. Belief in process versus belief in pattern. Some accused others of disrespecting the family by questioning the verdict. Others argued that unquestioned closure was the greater disrespect. The arguments circled endlessly, feeding on themselves, generating heat, but little light. Still, in the noise, fragments of insight occasionally surfaced, overlooked details stitched together in ways no single investigator had attempted before. One such detail was the weather. A sudden shift that night, a wind pattern that would have carried sound farther than usual, that would have erased tracks more quickly, that would have altered how the scene looked by morning. It had been noted once, then forgotten. Reintroduced now, it reframed assumptions about witnesses, about what could and could not have been heard. The environment, long treated as a passive backdrop, began to look more like an accomplice. Another detail involved the truck itself. A mechanical quirk that could cause it to stall unexpectedly, then restart without warning. Mechanics debated it fiercely, some dismissing it, others insisting it mattered. If true, It suggested a scenario less controlled, more chaotic, an interruption rather than a plan. The engine running when the truck was found had always felt symbolic. Now it felt mechanical, accidental, stripped of narrative intent. That shift unsettled people. It made the story less neat, less moral, more human. Law enforcement leadership issued a carefully worded statement reaffirming confidence in the conviction while acknowledging the public's interest. It satisfied no one completely, which was perhaps the point. Maintaining balance had become the goal, not resolution. The case existed now in a suspended state, officially resolved, unofficially porous, its edges constantly probed, but never breached. Behind the scenes, evidence storage logs were quietly reviewed. Boxes opened. Items re-examined. Nothing miraculous appeared. No lost sample. No overlooked photograph that suddenly changed everything. What emerged instead was a clearer picture of how little there had ever been to work with. The case had always been a scaffold built around absence, and absence does not age well. The convicted man's health declined. With it, his tone shifted again. Less defiant. Less theatrical. In one interview, he said something that stuck with those who heard it. I became the ending because they needed one. It was impossible to know whether that was manipulation, self-pity, or something closer to truth. The statement spread quietly, quoted without commentary, allowing listeners to draw their own conclusions. Many did. As the possibility of a formal reopening faded, replaced by a kind of institutional limbo, people adjusted their expectations. The question was no longer whether the case would be solved differently, but whether it would ever be spoken about honestly, without the protective language of certainty. That honesty, some believed, might be the closest thing to justice still available. On County Road 114, a new generation drove past without knowing why their parents slowed down there, why conversations sometimes stopped mid-sentence, as the headlights swept across the shoulder. Memory is fragile, but place is stubborn. The road remembered even when people tried not to. It held the weight of an interruption that had never been properly acknowledged. The story, by now, had shed its sharpest edges, but not its pull. It lingered in lectures, in podcasts, in quiet conversations that started with hesitation and ended with silence. It had become less about blame and more about vulnerability, about what happens when certainty is declared too soon and doubt is left to fester. In the end, the most dangerous idea was not that the wrong person had been convicted, but that the right story had never been told. That the truth, fragmented and inconvenient, had been simplified for survival, for sanity, for closure. And once simplified, it resisted complication, resisted challenge, resisted the messy work of revision. The case remains officially solved. That word still appears in databases, in summaries, in headlines recycled year after year. But beneath it, the story continues to shift, subtly, relentlessly, shaped by new voices, old memories, and the quiet understanding that some answers do not arrive all at once, fully formed. Some emerge slowly, through cracks, through doubt, through the courage to admit that certainty was an illusion all along. And so the night in 2003 endures, not as a closed chapter, but as a pressure point in time, a reminder that truth does not always align with resolution, and that sometimes, the most honest thing a case can offer is not an answer, but a question that refuses to go away. By the time the case reached its third decade, it had taken on a strange dual life, static in the eyes of the law, but restless everywhere else, like a body declared dead that keeps showing signs of movement. It surfaced in unexpected places. In training seminars. In late-night conversations between officers who had never worked it, but somehow felt shaped by it. In the pauses people took before answering questions about trust, about certainty, about whether justice is something you reach or something you approximate. The case had stopped asking who did it and started asking something far more uncomfortable. How much ambiguity can a system survive without breaking? The evidence, such as it was, aged poorly. Cassette tapes hissed. Digital files corrupted. Notes written in haste lost context, when the hands that wrote them were no longer there to explain. What had once felt urgent now felt brittle, like something that would shatter if examined too closely. Every review risked destroying what little coherence remained. And yet, not reviewing it felt worse, like a quiet betrayal of the very idea of truth. A former juror came forward anonymously, years after the trial, compelled not by guilt, but by confusion that never fully settled. She described the deliberations not as decisive, but as exhausted. The confession had carried enormous weight, she said, not because it was flawless, but because it offered relief. It gave shape to chaos. It allowed the jury to imagine an ending. Doubts were voiced, but they were drowned out by the pressure to conclude, to deliver something definitive to a waiting community. Her words weren't an accusation. They were an admission of human limitation, and they landed harder than any allegation ever could. Those limitations echoed through every layer of the case. Investigators had worked with what they had. Prosecutors had built the strongest story available to them. Jurors had done what they believed was right. No single moment of failure stood out, no villain wearing a badge, or holding a gavel. Instead, there was a sequence of compromises, each small enough to justify, each understandable on its own, but together forming a path that narrowed until no other ending felt possible. That realization was harder to confront than the idea of malice, because it implicated everyone. The victim's name began appearing less often in headlines, replaced by phrases like the case, or the conviction. Language shifted subtly, distancing the story from the person at its center. Those who remembered him as a son, a friend, a presence rather than a file number felt that shift keenly. They pushed back in small ways, correcting reporters, insisting on his humanity, reminding anyone who would listen that before he became a mystery, he had been alive in ordinary, unremarkable ways. He had plans. He had habits. He had no reason to disappear. New theories continued to surface, but they carried less urgency now, more resignation. A construction crew uncovered bones miles away, briefly igniting speculation before forensic analysis ruled them out. A former associate of a long whispered about figure died, prompting rumors of deathbed confessions that never materialized. Each event followed the same arc: anticipation, scrutiny, disappointment. The rhythm was familiar, almost ritualistic, and people learned to manage their expectations accordingly. In quiet offices, policy changes were discussed with the case as an unspoken reference point. Interrogation practices evolved. Recording requirements tightened. Oversight mechanisms strengthened. The system learned, even if this particular story did not resolve. That learning was cold comfort to those who lived with the loss, but it mattered. It meant the case had not been meaningless, even if it remained unresolved in spirit. The convicted man receded further into the background as his health declined. His voice, once loud and contradictory, grew softer, less insistent. In his final public statement, he did not proclaim innocence or guilt. He spoke instead about inevitability, about how stories choose people as much as people choose stories. Some interpreted it as a confession. Others as deflection. Most heard it as the sound of someone who no longer believed clarity was possible. The road continued to exist in its quiet defiance of narrative. At dusk, the light hit it just right, long shadows stretching across the asphalt, making distance hard to judge. Locals still felt it, that subtle shift in awareness, the sense of passing through a place where something had gone wrong in a way that never fully corrected itself. No sign marked it, but memory did, etched invisibly into routine. The family found their own way forward, not by resolving the questions, but by living alongside them. They spoke less about the case and more about the person, sharing stories that had nothing to do with disappearance or verdicts. It was an act of reclamation, a refusal to let the mystery define everything. Still, on certain nights, the old questions returned, uninvited and persistent, reminders that moving on does not mean forgetting. Academics and commentators eventually turned their attention elsewhere, drawn to newer cases, fresher controversies. The spotlight shifted, but the case did not disappear. It settled into a quieter place, less visible, but deeply embedded, a reference point for anyone grappling with the limits of certainty. It became less about solving and more about acknowledging complexity, about recognizing that some stories resist resolution not because of a lack of effort, but because of the way truth fractures under pressure. When people asked now whether the case was solved, the answer depended on what they meant by solved. Legally, yes. Procedurally, yes. Emotionally, morally, existentially, the answer was far less clear. Solved implied completeness, and nothing about this story felt complete. It felt paused, suspended in a moment that stretched across decades, defying the neat boundaries imposed by verdicts and paperwork. In the end, what remains is not a single unanswered question, but a constellation of them, orbiting a night that changed everything and explained nothing. They persist not because people enjoy uncertainty, but because uncertainty has a way of insisting on itself when the truth has not been fully spoken. The case continues to live in that space, neither fully alive nor fully at rest, a reminder that some endings are provisional, some answers temporary, and some silences louder than any confession. And so the story carries on, not forward, but outward, touching everything around it, shaping how people think about justice, about memory, about the stories we tell ourselves to survive. The road remains. The night remains. The question remains. And as long as it does, the case, no matter what the records say, is not truly over. What happens to a mystery when the people who remember it best begin to disappear? That question crept in quietly, without ceremony, as age thinned the ranks of those who had been there from the beginning. Witnesses died. Investigators retired, then passed on. Voices that once carried authority faded into archives and half-remembered quotes. The case didn't end, but its guardians did, and with each loss, the space for certainty narrowed. What remained was interpretation, second-hand memory, the fragile scaffolding of a story told too many times to too many people, each retelling smoothing over discomfort, sanding down doubt. In one of the last interviews before his death, a senior detective, who had worked the original scene, spoke candidly, no longer bound by ambition or institutional loyalty. He described the night as chaotic beyond what the reports conveyed. Too many people. Too much noise. Too much urgency colliding with too little information. He admitted that early assumptions had hardened faster than they should have, that once a direction felt right, alternatives began to feel like distractions. We didn't ignore things, he said, choosing his words carefully. We prioritized. The distinction mattered to him. To others, it sounded uncomfortably close to the same thing. He talked about the truck again, about how wrong it felt even then. Running engines don't mean much on paper, he said, but they mean everything in real life. They suggest interruption. Urgency. A moment cut short. He said they treated it as a clue, but not as a question. They assumed it pointed outward, toward an assailant, rather than inward, toward circumstance. That choice, he implied, shaped everything that followed. As these admissions surfaced, the case took on a new texture, less accusatory, more reflective. It wasn't about corruption or conspiracy. It was about momentum. About how quickly an investigation can tip from open inquiry into narrative defense. Once a story feels coherent, it resists revision. Doubt becomes noise. Silence becomes confirmation. The machinery of justice, designed to move forward, struggles to step sideways. The town felt the shift even if it couldn't articulate it. Conversations about the case became less heated, more subdued. People spoke in hypotheticals, in softened language, as if afraid that too much certainty in either direction might break something fragile. The idea that there might never be a definitive answer settled in slowly, like a weather change you don't notice until you're already cold. A new generation of officers inherited the legend rather than the investigation. For them, the case was a cautionary tale told during training, a reminder of how thin the line can be between resolution and assumption. They studied it not to solve it, but to avoid repeating it. In that sense, the case continued to work, shaping behavior, influencing judgment, long after its active life had ended. The family noticed how the language around the case changed over time. Early on, people had asked if they wanted justice. Later, they asked if they had closure. Now, they asked how they were coping. The shift was subtle but profound. It signaled an acceptance that the questions might outlive the answers, that survival might matter more than certainty. The family answered politely, honestly, without expectation. They had learned that explanations don't always bring relief, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop demanding them. Occasionally, something small would happen that reignited old instincts. A piece of property changing hands. A structure demolished. A rumor that something had been found, then wasn't. Each time, hearts lifted briefly, then settled back into their familiar ache. The emotional muscle memory was strong. Hope rose automatically, even when logic said it shouldn't. That reflex, more than anything, revealed how unfinished the story remained. In private journals and unpublished notes, a few investigators documented their lingering doubts, writing not for the record, but for themselves. They questioned decisions, replayed interviews, wondered about paths not taken. These writings were never meant to be read, but they existed, quiet testaments to the weight of responsibility carried long after a case is declared complete. They suggested that resolution, when it comes too soon, leaves a residue that doesn't wash away with time. The convicted man, now frail, stopped speaking publicly. His silence was interpreted in every possible way. Some saw it as resignation, others as guilt, a few as the exhaustion of someone who had said everything he knew how to say and realized it would never be enough. When he was transferred to a medical facility, the news barely registered outside a small circle of people who still followed the case closely. His role in the story diminished, not because it became clearer, but because it became less relevant. The mystery no longer revolved around him. It revolved around the space he occupied. The road, unchanged in any meaningful way, continued to anchor the story. People still measured time against that night, even if they didn't realize it. Before the disappearance. After the disappearance. Before the verdict. After the verdict. These invisible markers shaped memory, giving structure to an experience that resisted order. Place became the only constant in a narrative defined by flux. Scholars who revisited the case years later wrote less about guilt and more about epistemology, about how we know what we know, and how often certainty is constructed rather than discovered. They argued that cases like this reveal not the failure of justice, but its limits. That acknowledgement, uncomfortable as it was, offered a different kind of clarity, one rooted not in answers, but in honesty. As attention waned, the case settled into its final form, not solved, not unsolved, but suspended. A story with an ending written in ink and a meaning written in pencil. It existed in records and memories, in law and in doubt, occupying a space where contradiction was not a flaw, but a defining feature. The night in 2003 remained intact, unaltered by everything that came after it. The engine running. The empty road. The moment before everything diverged. That image, simple and incomplete, endured because it refused to explain itself. It asked nothing. It promised nothing. It simply existed, a reminder that some truths do not announce themselves with clarity, and some stories, no matter how many times they are told, remain unresolved not because we failed to listen, but because the answer was never as singular as we hoped. And so the case continues, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the quiet spaces between certainty and doubt, where memory lingers and questions breathe. It remains a testament to interruption, to the fragile boundary between knowing and believing, and to the enduring power of a silence that has never quite learned how to end. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in through paperwork and procedure, through files stamped and shelved, through meetings where the case was no longer on the agenda. Silence has a way of disguising itself as progress. When nothing new happens, it can feel like stability. When questions stop being asked, it can feel like peace. But beneath that calm, the case continued to vibrate, a low-frequency hum felt only by those who stood still long enough to notice it. Years after the verdict, an internal audit quietly reviewed how evidence had been handled in several older cases. Not as an accusation. As maintenance. As routine. The Texas 2003 file was included almost by accident, flagged by an algorithm looking for patterns in chain of custody gaps and late disclosures. No alarms. No red ink. Just a cluster of small inconsistencies that, taken individually, meant nothing. Taken together, they suggested a story that had been assembled in real time, under pressure, with imperfect tools. One discrepancy involved the timeline. A difference of minutes, maybe more. A phone ping logged after a witness said they'd already left the area. A patrol car recorded passing a mile marker before it should have been possible. These weren't smoking guns. They were the kind of details that live in margins, that get waved away during trials, because they don't change the shape of the narrative. But narratives are sensitive creatures. Change the margins and the center shifts, quietly, almost imperceptibly. The audit report never made headlines. It was circulated internally, discussed in careful language, its conclusions couched in caution. No material impact on outcome, it read. Procedures consistent with standards of the time. A line that carried weight and offered cover. The case remained solved, officially. Unofficially, the ground beneath it felt less solid than it once had. For the community, the case had already entered myth. People remembered where they were when the news broke, when the arrest was announced, when the verdict came down. They remembered emotions more clearly than facts. Fear. Relief. Doubt. Over time, those feelings rearranged themselves, forming a story that made sense not because it was accurate, but because it was survivable. That's how communities heal. Not by knowing everything, but by knowing enough. A local journalist, newly arrived and unburdened by old loyalties, began asking questions that had long gone dormant. Not accusatory questions. Curious ones. Why did this witness recant and then recant the recantation? Why did this evidence arrive when it did? Why was this alternate suspect dismissed so quickly? Each question, by itself, seemed harmless. Together, they formed a rhythm that felt uncomfortably familiar to those who had lived through the original investigation. The journalists' articles didn't accuse. They contextualized. They reminded readers that certainty is often retrospective, that decisions made under duress can calcify into dogma if left unexamined. The response was immediate and divided. Some welcomed the scrutiny, grateful that the case was being treated as something alive rather than embalmed. Others saw it as a reopening of wounds, an unnecessary stirring of a settled past. Both reactions were sincere. Both were rooted in fear. The family watched from a distance, practiced now in managing expectation. They had learned not to lean too heavily on momentum, to treat renewed attention as weather rather than prophecy. Storms pass. So do clear skies. What remains is the landscape, altered but intact. They spoke when asked, declined when tired, protected their private grief with the quiet authority of those who have nothing left to prove. Behind closed doors, legal minds revisited transcripts, not to overturn, but to understand. Law schools used the case as a study in narrative dominance, in how early framing can shape perception long after contradictory evidence emerges. Students debated whether justice is a destination or a process, whether a verdict closes a case or simply changes its vocabulary. The Texas 2003 case became a mirror, reflecting not just what happened, but how systems behave when under strain. The convicted man's health continued to decline. His world shrank to hallways and routines, to memories replayed without context or correction. Those who interacted with him described a person worn smooth by time, less defensive, less articulate, more distant. Whether this was acceptance or erosion was impossible to say. The human mind adapts in ways that defy clean interpretation. Silence, again, became ambiguous. One afternoon, a former investigator uncovered a box while clearing out a storage unit. Inside were copies of early interview notes, drafts never finalized, questions circled but not asked. He hesitated before turning them over, unsure whether they represented contribution or complication. In the end, he submitted them quietly, without commentary. The notes didn't rewrite history. They complicated it. They suggested a version of the investigation that was less confident, more uncertain, more human. Those notes sparked a brief internal discussion. Nothing formal. No task force. Just a handful of people acknowledging that the case, for all its official resolution, still resisted closure. They agreed on one thing: reopening it would require more than curiosity. It would require courage, resources, and a willingness to accept outcomes that might satisfy no one. The discussion ended where many do. With a nod. With a sigh. With silence. The road remained unchanged, but time altered how it was perceived. New businesses opened nearby. Traffic increased. The isolation that once defined the scene softened. And yet, for those who knew, the place retained its gravity. They felt it in the way conversations slowed when passing through, in the way eyes drifted to the shoulder where nothing marked what had happened. Absence, when given enough time, becomes a landmark. Public memory continued to fragment. Online forums hosted debates that grew increasingly abstract, less tethered to evidence and more to ideology. Some framed the case as proof of systemic failure. Others as a cautionary tale about doubt eroding trust. The truth, whatever it was, became secondary to what the case symbolized. Symbols are easier to carry than facts. They fit neatly into arguments, into identities, into narratives larger than any single life. And yet, beneath all of it, the original questions persisted, unchanged. What happened in those final moments? Why did the evidence point where it did? What was missed, and what was assumed? These questions didn't demand answers so much as they demanded acknowledgement. That some mysteries aren't solved by verdicts. That some truths remain provisional, contingent, shaped by the limits of perception and memory. As years layered themselves over the case, the distinction between solved and unsolved blurred. Officially, the matter was closed. Practically, it remained open in the only place that mattered, the collective conscience of those who had lived with it. The case became less about guilt or innocence and more about the cost of certainty, about what is gained when a story ends and what is lost when it ends too soon. The night in 2003 continued to echo, not as a moment frozen in time, but as a question carried forward. Engines still start and stop. Roads still empty and fill. Lives still pivot on ordinary decisions. The case reminded anyone willing to listen that resolution is not the same as understanding, and that sometimes, the most honest answer a system can give is not a name or a sentence, but a pause. In that pause, the story lived on, incomplete and unresolved, a testament not to failure, but to the complexity of truth. It waited, not for closure, but for humility, for the recognition that some cases do not end. They endure. Time has a way of rearranging priorities. What once felt urgent becomes historical. What once demanded answers learns to live with questions. By the time the case crossed its second decade, it no longer moved through the world as a crime story. It moved as a presence. Something people felt rather than discussed, something that surfaced unexpectedly, inside comments and pauses, in the way certain names were still spoken more quietly than others. The files remained intact, preserved in climate-controlled rooms where the air never changed and the lights never dimmed. Paper yellowed anyway. Ink softened. Handwriting lost its sharpness. These physical changes mirrored something less visible, the erosion of certainty. Evidence does not decay in isolation. It decays in meaning, as context thins and the people who supplied that context vanish. A fingerprint remains a fingerprint, but the confidence with which it is interpreted does not survive forever. A retired judge, asked years later about the trial, paused longer than expected before answering. He said the case had felt solid at the time. Not perfect. Solid. He emphasized the word as if testing whether it still held. He admitted that if the same evidence were presented today, under modern scrutiny, the outcome might not be identical. Not because the facts had changed, but because the standards had. Juries now expected more. Courts now questioned narratives once accepted without resistance. Progress, he said, has a way of rewriting the past without touching it. The community had moved on in visible ways. New families arrived with no memory of the night in 2003. They drove the road without knowing its weight. Their children learned the town's history in fragments, simplified and softened, stripped of unresolved edges. For them, the case was a footnote, a line in an old article, something adults spoke about when nostalgia turned dark. This generational distance created a strange freedom. The story could now be re-examined without personal stake, but also without emotional gravity. Those who remembered felt that loss keenly. Memory, when unshared, begins to feel unstable. They worried that if no one else remembered the questions themselves might disappear. So they kept talking, not loudly, not publicly, but persistently. At kitchen tables. On porches. In the slow cadence of people who know that repetition is a form of preservation. Occasionally, someone would claim to have new information. A story overheard years ago. A detail dismissed at the time. Most led nowhere. A few led to uncomfortable conversations. None led to answers. But each reminder that the case could still move, even slightly, reinforced a collective understanding. The story was not as finished as it pretended to be. The legal status never changed. The conviction stood. Appeals exhausted themselves against procedural walls designed to favor finality over reconsideration. That was not a flaw. It was a feature. The system, after all, cannot function if every resolved case remains perpetually fluid. Stability requires endings. Justice requires them too, or at least the appearance of them. What the system could not account for was the emotional residue left behind when an ending failed to satisfy the deeper need for understanding. The convicted man's name slowly detached from the crime in public consciousness. It remained in records, but it lost its emotional charge. He became less a villain and more a symbol, a placeholder in a narrative that demanded a figure to absorb its tension. Whether he deserved that role became less important than the role itself. Stories need anchors. Even uncertain ones. In the absence of new facts, interpretation filled the void. Analysts dissected behavior. Linguists examined phrasing from old interviews. Psychologists speculated about memory under stress. Each discipline offered a lens, not a solution. The case became interdisciplinary not because it invited collaboration, but because it resisted conclusion. It asked to be looked at from every angle, and still refused to resolve into a single shape. The family continued to live in the aftermath, their grief no longer acute, but no less present. They spoke of the case as something that existed alongside their lives rather than within them. A parallel track. They had birthdays and losses unrelated to the crime. Joys that did not erase pain. Pain that no longer consumed joy. This coexistence was not closure. It was adaptation. They understood something outsiders often missed, that knowing exactly what happened would not restore what was lost. It might answer questions. It might satisfy curiosity. But it would not undo time. In some ways, the uncertainty had become part of their connection, a space where memory could live without contradiction. Certainty, they feared, might flatten that space, replacing complexity with something simpler and colder. The case resurfaced periodically in academic circles, cited in discussions about cognitive bias, investigative tunnel vision, and the psychology of certainty. It was never held up as an obvious miscarriage of justice. It was more troubling than that. It was presented as plausible, reasonable, convincing. And that, scholars argued, was exactly why it mattered. Because the most dangerous errors are not the outrageous ones. They are the subtle ones that feel correct in the moment. Late one night, years later, a former patrol officer drove the road again, alone. No reason. No destination. Just muscle memory guiding him back to a place his mind never fully left. He parked briefly, engine idling, listening to the sound echo into the dark. He later said the road felt smaller than he remembered. Narrower. Less dramatic. The danger, he realized, had never been the place. It had been the assumptions carried into it. The case, by then, existed in layers. The official version. The contested version. The remembered version. The forgotten version. None of them fully aligned. All of them claimed legitimacy. Together, they formed something closer to truth than any single narrative could manage on its own. A truth that was fragmented, provisional, and resistant to neat packaging. As the years continued to pass, the case did what unresolved stories always do. It stopped asking to be solved and started asking to be understood. Not as a puzzle with missing pieces, but as a human event shaped by fear, urgency, error, and belief. It asked what happens when the need for answers outruns the available facts. When resolution becomes more comforting than accuracy. The night in 2003 did not change. It could not. But everything around it did. Language evolved. Standards shifted. Memory softened. The case remained, suspended between what was decided and what was still doubted, between the finality of a verdict and the persistence of unease. And in that space, the story continued to breathe, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. A reminder that some cases are not defined by whether they are solved or unsolved, but by the questions they leave behind, and by the quiet understanding that certainty, once claimed, is never as permanent as it seems. There comes a point when a case stops belonging to the people involved and starts belonging to time itself. That moment is hard to mark. It doesn't arrive with a headline or a ruling. It arrives quietly, when the case is no longer argued but referenced, no longer investigated but invoked. By then, the Texas 2003 story had crossed that threshold. It was no longer something to be fixed. It was something to be carried. In archives and databases, the case lived as a sequence of facts arranged to suggest inevitability. Dates, names, outcomes. But outside those controlled environments, the story resisted linearity. People remembered it out of order. A face before a motive. A rumor before a fact. An emotion before an explanation. Memory, unlike law, does not move chronologically. It circles. It returns. It pauses where it hurts. A criminologist reviewing the case years later described it as structurally complete, but emotionally unfinished. The phrase stuck. It captured the uneasy balance between procedural closure and human doubt. Everything required to end the case had been done. Everything required to understand it had not. That distinction mattered, even if it changed nothing in practice. The technology that once promised clarity had advanced far beyond what investigators in 2003 could have imagined. New methods. New analytics. New confidence in what data could reveal. And yet, when experts revisited the physical evidence, they encountered a familiar limitation. Technology can amplify what exists. It cannot resurrect what was never preserved. Gaps remained gaps. Assumptions, once baked into the record, could not be extracted without dismantling the entire structure. There was talk, briefly, of retesting. Of re-examining. Of applying modern tools to old questions. The idea generated excitement, then hesitation. Retesting risked confirming the verdict as much as challenging it. And confirmation, in this context, carried its own burden. To revalidate a conclusion still shadowed by doubt might silence questions permanently, even if those questions deserved space to exist. In the end, caution prevailed. The evidence stayed where it was. The questions stayed where they always had. The road continued to change in small, ordinary ways. A sign replaced. A shoulder widened. The physical landscape adapted to new needs, indifferent to the history embedded beneath its surface. But some people still slowed as they passed, without fully knowing why. Muscle memory outlasted conscious recall. The body remembered what the mind tried to release. The family marked time differently now. Not by anniversaries of the crime, but by milestones that proved life had continued despite it. Graduations. Moves. Quiet achievements that carried no headlines. They had learned to live without answers not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was paralysis. Their resilience was not loud. It did not demand recognition. It simply endured. When asked, occasionally, whether they still believed the case would ever truly be solved, they answered with careful honesty. Solved how? Legally, it already was. Emotionally, perhaps never. Spiritually, maybe in ways that had nothing to do with facts or verdicts. Their understanding of resolution had evolved beyond the binary. They no longer expected a single moment that would make sense of everything. They expected a series of moments, small and imperfect, that would allow them to keep going. The broader public engaged with the case sporadically, often through documentaries or articles that framed it as a mystery with an ending that didn't quite fit. Viewers debated it online, distanced by screens and time. Some spoke with certainty born of hindsight. Others with empathy. Most with incomplete information. The case became content, and in becoming content, it lost some of its gravity. But it gained reach. New eyes meant new interpretations, even if they led nowhere. For those who had been there at the beginning, this transformation was unsettling. They watched as the case was retold with different emphases, different villains, different morals. Each version claimed insight. None captured the confusion of the original moment. The fear. The urgency. The sense that something fragile was slipping away faster than anyone could grasp it. That feeling, they knew, could not be recreated. It belonged to a specific night, in a specific year, under conditions that no longer existed. The convicted man remained alive, but increasingly absent from the narrative. His physical decline mirrored his narrative disappearance. He was no longer central to discussions of the case. He was referenced, not examined. His presence lingered like a footnote, necessary but insufficient. The mystery had grown larger than him, larger than any single person. In private, some who had worked the case still wrestled with unresolved thoughts. Not regrets, exactly. More like alternate timelines imagined during quiet moments. What if that question had been asked differently? What if that assumption had been challenged sooner? These thoughts did not accuse. They wondered. Wondering, they had learned, was the mind's way of staying honest. The case also shaped those who came after. Young investigators learned its outline during training, not as a failure, but as a lesson in humility. They were taught that evidence speaks, but only in the language we allow it. That urgency can distort perception. That confidence, unchecked, can become its own blindfold. In this way, the case continued to serve a purpose, even if it never yielded new answers. As the years accumulated, the distinction between memory and meaning grew sharper. People forgot details, but remembered how the case made them feel. Uneasy. Unsettled. Alert. Those emotions persisted, because they were rooted not in what was known, but in what was missing. Absence has a longer shelf life than fact. The night in 2003 remained untouched, immune to reinterpretation. No new theory could alter what had happened, only how it was understood. The running engine. The empty stretch of road. The sudden divergence of lives. These images survived, because they asked nothing of the viewer. They did not explain. They did not justify. They simply waited. And so the case endured in a strange, suspended state. Officially closed. Emotionally open. A story told not to resolve tension, but to acknowledge it. To sit with uncertainty rather than rush to escape it. To accept that some questions are not meant to be answered cleanly, and some silences are not meant to be broken. In that acceptance, the Texas 2003 case found its final form. Not as a puzzle solved, but as a reminder. Of limits. Of fallibility. Of the cost of believing that every story can be neatly concluded. It remained, quietly, persistently, a shadow at the edge of understanding, where certainty fades and truth becomes something we approach, but never fully reach.